Okay, so time to tear into the transmission on this thing. And I'm trying to figure out what I'm getting into because the service manual is very vague as to how the detents and the shift rails work on it, or how the detents work and the shift rails on this thing. So I finally ended up going and getting my parts book, because the service book doesn't actually show where the detents are or how they are assembled. But from what I can gather in reading the single, like, 2-sentence paragraph about the detents in the service manual and the way this picture is, it appears that the detents are actually trapped in between the shift rails, and they come out the back, and there's a plug on the other side of that boss in the back of the transmission, and they come out the rear. But you got to get the first shift rail out to get the detents out, because the rear shift rail is for first and reverse, and the front shift rail is for second and third. So yeah, that's a little. I was hoping that they had them in like plugs in the top of the transmission, and you just pulled the top cover off, and there was a boss there, and you pulled the pipe plugs out, and the detents and springs came out. But got to get both shift rails out, which still isn't a huge deal. But you have to get the cables unhooked and tie them off so that they're out of the way, and get the top cover off and drain the oil and all that fancy stuff. Okay, well, get this cover pulled off, and if we don't see any grenaded gears, that'll be half the battle won. I got the oil dropped, no big chunk came out. There was some metal shavings on the magnet on the drain plug, but you'd expect that out of a transmission this old. The oil is clean, so never made any goofy noises that you can hear, so you'd like to think everything in there's okay. Don't want that in there. Everything looks all right at first glance. Well, everything appears to be okay. Third gear is a little, or the one that would be second and third gear, which is that guy right there, is a tad bit beat up. But that probably comes from A, popping out of third gear on me, and B, second gear is the one that you use the most when you're when you're running the machine, so that's got the most use on it. So you'd expect that one to be a little more worn, but I don't see anything there alarming like, oh my god, we got to change the gear. If it was a brand spanking new transmission, I'd be slightly concerned, but it's not a brand spanking new transmission. The diff gear looks good. Like I say, hopefully it is all in the detents. But in order to get to that point, need to get the forks off and get the rails out. So yep, that's where we're at right now, I think. So I don't see anything out of alignment. I got a hard time believing that we got a bearing going out, because if you got a bearing going out, you generally tend to hear it. and it would probably not stay in any gear. So yep. So time to pop them shift forks off the rails so that I can actually get the rails out and check out the detent balls and their spring. Okay, so I got the roll pin drove out of the first reverse rail that holds the fork on. So if I'm reading the book right, it should just pull out. Should. I don't have to come all the way out because all I am after is the detent parts. Well, that right there is going to be plenty. Get that out of there before it goes in the oil bucket. Well, hopefully I don't drop that. There's the detent, and by all rights it should have popped out of that hole. So apparently it's stuck because there's nothing that retains the balls in there that the book claims. So interesting. So to make life easier, I just pulled both shift rails, get them out of the way, and I think I found the problem. The detent for second, third shift rail is not even entering the rail bore, so it was never engaging a detent. So hopefully I can get that stuff wiggled out of there and get in there and clean the hole up, free everything up, and problem solved. Well, there's the detents. They were definitely stuck. It was all I could do to get them pushed out. Doesn't help that there's no good way to get in there. I had to take an angle, 90-degree angle pick and shove them out, but hopefully they moved. The spring's not broke, so I got the rails and the forks soaking to get the varnish off of them. And I'm going to let them sit for a while before I can put them back in. So I'm going to put these in just to see how they move and go from there. Alright, I got the rails and the forks cleaned up. They look good. So I should be ready to go back in. And the way they got this, the first reverse rail actually rides on the third rail, or the second rail. It saddles it to hold it. So you got to have that in there. And then the second, third rail goes in. Or fork, I mean. And then you could put the second, third gear rail in. And when you're assembling this, they want you to put it into the neutral position, which should be somewhere right around there. And that lets the detent fall in so that you can slam the neck shift rail in. And you need too far. There we go. And those things were definitely stuck because when I pulled this rail out, which is the one for third gear, when I pulled that out, with 2 fingers I just pulled the rail out. There was no detent whatsoever. So we're definitely making a move in the right direction. Now the shift forks are held onto the rails with roll pins, so you drive the roll pin back in, then they want you to run a lock wire around there so that if the roll pin ever breaks or falls out, it can't go down and into the gears, so you gotta get that. Alright, so the rails and the forks are back assembled. I got the shift cables back on. So before I button anything else up, see if I can feel a difference. I ought to. Oh yeah. Now you can actually feel a detent there. Before there was nothing in the center, you just fell right from one to the other. So yeah, hopefully that takes care of that problem, but I won't know till I go to drive it. It's got to be better because that detent wasn't working at all. But now I got to get oil back in it, which I'm going to do before I put the cover on because this thing doesn't have a top fill hole, so I assume they want you to fill it through the check plug, but I got this big gaping hole here, so it's going to be a whole lot easier to fill it this way. So fill it with oil and put the cover back on. Well, it's full of oil. Ready to put the gasket on and the gasket and the top cover. Apparently cutting gaskets is becoming a lost art because I spent probably better part of 2 hours driving around. I had to end up going to 5 places before I found a piece of gasket material big enough to cut this out of. And we used to have a local place here that he had like 6 or 7 different rolls of it just in bulk, different thicknesses, and you walk in and tell him how thick you want it and he'd say how much, and he'd go in and unroll it off the roll and cut you a slice off and sold it to you by the foot. Apparently nobody does that anymore. So anyway, I got that gasket cut out. Luckily when the cover came off, the old gasket, it all came off with the cover, and I was able to very carefully scrape it off and got it off intact for the most part so I could trace it and copy it. And there's going to be the idiots to say, well, you could have just used Permatex. Well, or RTV. Yeah, I don't give a shit what it says on the tube. That is not gasket maker, that is gasket sealer. You don't use that shit to make a gasket. If it's a flat surface like this that originally had a cardboard gasket in it, you put the damn thing back together with a new cardboard gasket. And then we use Aviation Permatex gasket sealer. That's basically more of a shellac, and it just goes on and kind of glues everything together. So that way you can't over apply it, and it doesn't go oozing inside and get wadded up in the gears and the bearings and everything, and next thing you know you're back tearing it apart because you blew a bearing out because it got full of Permatex. So anyway, get all that put together, and this project should be over. Well, with any luck, that solves that problem. I really hope it does, because if it doesn't, that means I gotta drop the transmission and start pulling shafts and checking bearings, and I don't want to do that. As far as I can get my hand down in there and feel the input shaft and the counter shaft, I couldn't feel anything. And if the bearings are out, you'd think there would have been something on the magnets, or something would have fell out in the bucket, and nothing. The magnets were, they had some real fine shit on them like you'd expect, and nothing fell in the bucket. So it has to have been that detent. The detent notches in the rails didn't have any wear marks in, or didn't have any like rub marks in them. Like the detent had made a notch that could just fall out. Everything was still nice and tight. So hopefully that does it. But with that out of the way, all I got left to do is change the oil, grease it, and I got a bearing I'm waiting on for the chopper, because when I was fixing the crack in the chopper, I found one of the bearings was bad. And the bearing itself wasn't actually bad, but it's a collar lock bearing, and somehow part of the eccentric that's on the inner race that the collar works against, somehow part of that eccentric had broke off, and somehow it didn't hurt the shaft any, and it was still biting. But I'm replacing it anyhow, because I couldn't, it won't grab any. How it was still together, I don't know, because I tried just to see if it was working. I tried putting the collar and everything back together on the shaft, and the collar wouldn't even bite the bearing. So that might have been what forced that to crack too, because as fast as that thing spins, that little bit of metal missing might have thrown it out of balance, and that might be what cracked the housing. But anyway, other than that, the rest of what I got to do with this is just routine maintenance. It ain't really worth mentioning. So I guess we're probably going to go ahead and call this thing ready to go. So that's it for this one. We'll catch you all on the next one.